Could be a good or bad thing. All right, we're in 1 Kings 22. 1 Kings chapter 22. This, of course, is the final chapter in 1 Kings. It's kind of a break. The story continues. Obviously, 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one book. They were divided for scroll purposes, not make the scroll so big. And especially during that time when you didn't have chapter and verse numbers, searching could become quite tedious. So they divided it into two, and in a pretty good place. And so, although we're ending what we know as 1 Kings, the story is far from over. So as we look at this chapter, we're going to see Ahab meet his death, which has been predicted 3 times over the last 3 chapters. And so, or actually 3 times over the last 2 chapters, including this chapter, and then it will finally take place. And so this chapter, the majority of it focuses on his death, as you can see in the outline on the board. The third prediction of his death, and then his death. And then we return to talk about Jehoshaphat, which we meet here with Ahab, and then the son of Ahab, Ahaziah, as he takes over, in Israel. And that's his line will continue on into 2 Kings chapter 1. All right? So let's begin. Let's just back up and recap. Let's begin at 22:1 because we kind of need to see the imagery of the first section, the first 12 verses, to understand the image that Micaiah sees in the latter half of the chapter. So for 3 years, Syria and Israel continued without war. Of course, that's chapter 20. But in the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came down to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel said to his servants, "Do you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and we keep quiet and do not take it out of the hand of the king of Syria?" Now, Ramoth Gilead, you remember we talked about last week, was a city of refuge. In 1 Kings 20, Ben-Hadad had promised to turn over cities, and apparently he hasn't, and so now they're going to go force his hand. And in verse 4, he said to Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to battle at Ramoth Gilead?" And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, and my horses as your horses." Now, when you look, Jehoshaphat only gets a small mention in Kings. In 2 Chronicles, he gets a long treatment, okay? So if you want to learn more about him, even some of the things of this incident, you need to look at 2 Chronicles 16, 17 through about the end of 19 or so. But basically, a short order, God rebukes Jehoshaphat for going to war with Ahab, for being an ally for him, because Ahab is extremely wicked. Jehoshaphat, we will learn, is actually a somewhat good king. And so anyway, but Jehoshaphat makes the request. You remember verse 5, "And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, 'Inquire first for the word of the Lord.' Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them," now you remember we debated about whether or not this was 400 prophets of the Lord or 400 prophets of Baal. Either one. They're certainly false prophets either way. He says, "Shall I go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain?" Now, this is a common thing that happened in this day. If you wanted to go to war, you consulted your religious leaders. And so this is not an uncommon thing. And then they said to him, "Go up, and the Lord will give it into the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire?" And so he kind of sees it and basically, is there somebody here that's not a yes man? What he's wanting to do is hear another opinion, okay? He wants to hear another opinion. And when you look at that, to me, that's respectable. Very respectable. It's very mature. Because, unfortunately, a lot of the times when we seek out counsel, we're looking for people to tell us and to confirm what we've already done or what we believe is the right thing. But what we should be seeking out is the opposite opinion of us. Okay? Some people are afraid to have a discussion with a person of the opposite opinion. And one of the reasons they're afraid is because they're afraid that their thinking will be exposed by the thoughts of the other side. But if I'm going to be honest, intellectually honest in how I make decisions and do things, I need to look at opinions across the board and see which opinion holds sway, which one is the right way to go. And so what Jehoshaphat is doing here is, this is great. You got 400 people saying, yes, do it. But he also has this nagging feeling on the inside, you can tell, that these guys are kind of yes men. And to have someone to disagree with you, I try to make it a regular practice in my reading and in discussions with people, when I'm talking about a subject, to call someone that I know will disagree with me. Because I want to hear how they think. I want to know what's going on. I want to see because if anything, first of all, if what I'm doing or what I believe is right, then what do I have to be threatened by? Of what am I afraid? But I can tell you through the years what has happened as I've dealt with people who disagreed with me. My thinking has been sharpened. They've forced me to think more deeply on subjects. May not necessarily have changed my opinion, but they forced me to think differently. And so it's important that we not go simply to yes men or go back to that echo chamber we talked about in some of the previous studies. So, verse 8, the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man of whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah the son of Imlah, but I hate him because he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil. Now again, we talked about Ahab. He's basically a teenager, an adolescent here. And Jehoshaphat said, let not the king say so, and so he just kind of brushes him off and says, oh, just get over it. Verse 9, then the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, bring quickly Micaiah the son of Imlah. Now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, were sitting on their thrones. Now this is important for what we'll see in Micaiah's vision in just a minute. So they're sitting on their thrones, arrayed in robes, and at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, which is the capital of the northern tribes, of course. And the prophets were prophesying. And Zedekiah, the son of Kenah, made for himself horns of iron and said, thus says the Lord, with these shall you push the Syrians until they are destroyed. And all the prophets prophesied so and said, go up to Ramoth Gilead and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king. Now the horns, obviously, we talked about, were a symbol of strength. And so by acting this out, which would be, as we said last week, you know, if I get up on Sundays consistently and start acting out certain things, I mean, it doesn't fit with our cultural communication, okay? But for them, it was very common. You see it, when you study the prophets, you see stuff like this all the time. God will have them do things. Ezekiel does it, Isaiah does it, Jeremiah does it. And so it's just some kind of a representation. Now, of course, here they're wrong in what they're doing. They're just trying to encourage the king. And so while the king has sent to get Micaiah brought into the court to hear from him, all these other prophets are just pouring it on thick, okay? Yes, go and prosper. Yes, you'll go and prosper. Yes, you'll go and prosper. All right, now we're given in verse 13 insight into what happens next, or while they're prophesying. Verse 13, and the messenger who went to summon Micaiah said to him, behold, the words of the prophets with one accord are favorable to the king. Let your word be like the word of one of them and speak favorably. So what did he say? Yeah. We've already decided on this, and you need to get on board. I'm talking to you beforehand because I want you to be on board. And then you got to love what Micaiah says to him. But Micaiah said, as the Lord lives, what the Lord says to me, that I will speak. Throughout the prophets, many times they will call out, God will cry out against the false prophets who prophesy out of their own hearts. They just make it up. They claim it's from God, but they're just making it up. God didn't speak. A prophet, one of the definitions of a prophet, when you go back to Exodus 4 with Moses' interaction with God, and you remember he says, I'm not an eloquent speaker, and so God gives him Aaron, and he says, he will be your prophet, and you will be like God to him. What is he? He's giving us an imagery of what the God-prophet relationship is. That is, God delivers the message to the prophet, and the prophet sends it forth the way it is delivered, without alteration. That helps us to understand the God-prophet relationship. And so Micaiah is saying, I can't promise you I'm going to agree with you. I don't know. God has not, this is a time where God is speaking directly to prophets. God hasn't spoken to me yet. I can't promise you I'm going to agree with you. I have to say what God says. That's what I have to do. That's my job. Now, he could do and prophesy out of his own heart the same way that these individuals are, but not with God's approval. And that's what he's saying. And you have to honor him, because sometimes people want to play these games and want to pull you to their side. Well, if you're going to be honest about it, you have to say, I don't know yet. I can't give you an answer until I hear the whole story and until I hear what God has spoken on the matter. It's not like I'm deciding what we should do. We're simply waiting to understand the situation and for God to tell us what we're supposed to do. And so we have to be extremely cautious. And Micaiah gives us, it's courageous, but at the same time, it's very simple. What do you mean? I can't agree with you because I don't know what God has said yet. Okay? So, verse 15, and when he had come to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to Ramoth Gilead and battle, or shall we refrain? Same question he asked the previous prophets. And he, that is Micaiah, answered him, go up and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king. Now, this is where it looks like Micaiah is saying the same thing as the prophets, right? But he's not. Verse 16, but the king said to him, how many times shall I make you swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? So apparently, what Micaiah says, he says it dripping with sarcasm, right? Because not even Ahab is convinced. So, a lot of communication, well, there's a lot of debate in how communication works, but communication is more than just the words you use. It's also the tone, it's your body language, things along those lines, and it's debated about how the percentages should be proportioned out. But apparently Micaiah is definitely dripping with sarcasm, saying no. And so Ahab says, I don't believe you. I know you're not telling me the truth. So tell me what's really going to happen. And so what Micaiah does is a classic move. And basically he says, look, if you want me to just, you've got your mind made up already. You just want me to go along with you. And that's a problem. Because sometimes people have their minds made up about things and they're just looking for people to agree with them. And Micaiah said, look, if you're looking for somebody to agree with you, sure, knock yourself out. But you and I both know that's not what God wants. So, verse 17, Micaiah gives the real message. And he said, I saw all Israel scattered on mountains as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let these return to his home. Let each return to his home in peace. So sheep scattered on a mountain without a shepherd. What's the interpretation of what he's saying? You're going to die. And your people are going to be left scattered out on the battlefield like sheep without a shepherd. They're not going to have a commander. They're not going to have somebody to direct them. And so if you go to battle, this is what's going to happen. Verse 18, and the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? I told you this is what was going to happen. It always happens. And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab that he will go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And he said, and one said one thing and another said another. Then the Spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. Okay. Yes, sir. I don't know. It's a good question. Elijah was obviously present last chapter and did it. I don't know. I guess it kind of shows, too, that He didn't really have a good relationship with any of the prophets. He didn't have one with Elijah, doesn't have one with Micaiah. 2 Kings 20, we saw 3 or 4 others, no name. So, sure, it's possible that's why God chose him. I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know the answer. So here he is, and he sees this vision. Okay, so he says, "Hear the word of the Lord. Let me show you this vision. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne," which is a common theme in prophets. You see it in Isaiah 6. You see it in Daniel 7, Revelation 4, some other places like that. And so here you have God on his throne and all the host of heaven standing beside him on the right hand and the left. So the host of heaven, host just simply means an army, and it has reference to angelic beings, okay? So you have armies of angels standing beside him, which is also very common in Daniel 7 and in other places. Now, if you see this, this is a mirror of what we just read in the previous section, right? You had at the gate of Samaria, you had King Ahab, king of Israel, and you had King Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And they're sitting on their royal thrones, and all their prophets are in front of them, right? Well, now you see a heavenly version of that. Here is God sitting on his throne, and all the hosts, all of the angelic army is around him, okay? Now, God puts forth this question: who will go forth and basically entice Ahab? Who's going to go forth and entice? And one says one thing, one says another, and then a certain spirit stands up. We're not told who that certain spirit is. Some people have assumed it to be Satan. It's possible. We have occasions where that took place. For an example, Job chapters 1 and 2. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them, going into the presence of God to speak and to argue. In Zechariah chapter 3, there's a vision of the angel of the Lord and Joshua the high priest and Satan standing at his right hand. They're all in the presence of God, and he's ready to oppose him. So I don't know who this spirit is. Really, there's no indication in the text that says it could be Satan, but I don't see an indication in the text that says it's an evil angel. It would seem to me as I read the text that these are the faithful angels that serve God regularly. Okay? Now, 21, the Spirit came forward and said, "I will entice him." And he said, "By what means?" He said, "I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets." And he said, "You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so." Go tell them to prophesy a certain way. So what's happening here? God's telling, apparently, one of these angels to go out and to deceive the prophets. I guess the real question here that we have to ask is God complicit in lying? That's really the question that people ask when you come to this text. Is God somehow complicit in lying? Okay? There you go. Right. For those who couldn't hear, I think Ross said, I think he's allowing it to happen. He is, and I think he's onto something. I think this is a matter of sovereignty. God is in control of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that he is forcing it to happen, okay? For an example, sometimes in the Bible when God allows something to happen, he is spoken of as having done it himself. Okay? Go back to Job again. So here is the first round in Job chapter 1, and Satan says he's serving you for because you're bribing him, and God says, okay, you can touch everything he has, but you can't touch him. And so then we read, he goes out and he does that. He takes everything away from him. And then in the second chapter, Satan comes back for a second round. And God says, have you considered my servant Job, who fears God and turns away from evil, and yet he still holds fast his integrity? Now listen to how God frames this. Although you incite me to destroy him without cause. God said, you get me to destroy him without cause. But who was destroying Job? Who was inflicting it? Satan. But it all happened under the sovereign control of God. And so sometimes in the Bible, when God allows certain things to happen, it may be communicated in a way as if he is making it happen. That is, that's the way it can come across to us in our reading. And so, furthermore, there's another thing we need to consider here. So, to fit a lie is basically an intentional deception. Okay? We can get into all the technicalities people want to all day long, but a lie is an intentional deception. Okay? So we have to be really careful about the accusation of a liar. All right? Some person may not be lying. They may be telling everything they know. They just don't know the whole story. Okay? So a lie is an intentional deception. This whole vision right here, God is telling Ahab what? He told him exactly what happened. And he told him basically through this vision what? That the prophets were lying to him. God's not deceiving him in any way. He's giving him the whole story. God hasn't done anything wrong here. God hasn't deceived Ahab. He's given him all the information. He let the prophets go and do their thing, and then he brought his prophet in and said, okay, now let me show you the whole panorama here of what's going on. I'm telling you through my prophet that they're lying to you. So, that's why Micaiah's conclusion in 23 is, now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets, and the Lord has declared disaster for you. He's using it. Sometimes God will allow us, if a person is bound and determined to believe or do something, he will allow them to buy into that deception very strongly. Listen to what Paul said in the New Testament. He says, and with wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore, that is, therefore, because they did not love the truth, the idea is they rejected the truth, God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. If a person is bound and determined to do something their way and to believe something their way, God will give them every reason to let them do it. He'll let them. And that's what he's doing here with Ahab. Ahab is bound and his mind is made up. Remember, this exercise is not for him. Who's it for? Who asked for it? Who asked to inquire of prophets? Jehoshaphat. Who asked to inquire of a prophet of the Lord? Jehoshaphat. Why? Because Ahab's mind is made up. It has been from the very beginning. And so, that's what's taking place here. God is giving him the whole story, and he's telling him, you're going to meet your demise. You're playing right into what I told you was going to happen, which is you're going to die, and this is how you're going to die, and your prophets are deceiving you, and I just want full disclosure. I want you to know exactly what's going on. So, in verse 24, Zedekiah, one of these lead prophets on the other side, he struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, "How did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you?" And so that's a personal insult, by the way. To slap someone has always been a personal insult, almost universally. Even way back to something like the Code of Hammurabi, which was the old Babylonian Empire. Old Babylonian Empire. When you look at that code, you could be flogged or fined for slapping someone. Slapping has always been considered an absolute disrespect. Okay? It's considered that way in Scripture. You look at Jesus being slapped at his trial. You look at Paul being slapped at his trial in Acts 23. It's always considered to be a disgraceful thing to slap someone. And that's what he does here. He slaps him because he thinks he's being disrespectful. And he's insulted because this prophet, Zedekiah, thinks he's speaking by the Spirit of the Lord, and God is telling him, and Micaiah is saying, basically he's not, he's lying, and therefore Zedekiah gets upset. And so Micaiah said, "Behold, you shall see on the day when you go in the inner chamber to hide yourself." And so Zedekiah looks at Micaiah and says, "You're calling me a liar. That's not true. I've got the Spirit. How did it leave me and go to you to tell you to do this? I've got the Spirit." And he said, "You're going to find out when you're hiding like a little baby in a closet. You'll know that what I'm telling you is exactly right. You will see in the day when you go into an inner chamber to hide yourself. Because disaster is going to come, the king is going to die, and you're going to hide. You're going to run and hide for safety. And you're going to realize that what I've spoken is what is right, and what you've spoken is wrong." So the king said, "Seize Micaiah and take him back to Ammon, the governor of the city, and Joash, the king's son." Sometimes the king's son was in charge of some of the prisons. You see it a couple of times in Jeremiah 36 and Jeremiah 38. And he says, "And thus says the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him meager rations of bread and water until I come in peace." And Micaiah said, "If you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." And he said, "Hear all you peoples." So the king said, "Lock him up." Now this may have something to do with a Middle Eastern belief at the time that the prophets, when they spoke, they not only spoke the word of the Lord, but as they spoke it, their very words started the process of the fulfillment of it. And so locking him up was a way of supposedly, if I can lock the prophet up, I can keep the word from happening. I can keep the prophecy from happening. And so he says, we'll, just keep him alive, and then we'll deal with him when we get back. And Micaiah, quick on his feet, says what? "If I ever see you again, I'm not a true prophet." Because what's the test of a prophet? That's right, Deuteronomy 18. They asked that question, how are we going to know who's a prophet? And he said, if a prophet prophesies something and it does not come to pass, then don't fear him. He's not a prophet. But if he prophesies something and it does come to pass, that's the one you listen to. So Micaiah is playing off that principle. He said, look, if I ever see you alive again, I'm not telling the truth here. Because you're as good as dead. All right. Any questions or anything on those before we got a few minutes to look? It won't take much. It won't take very long to get through the battle itself. Right, 29. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. They leave Samaria and get their armies and get situated. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you wear your robes. Okay? He disguises himself. So that kind of makes you think for a minute, doesn't it? If he's confident that what Micaiah has said will not come to pass, well, why is he disguising himself? Why doesn't he want to wear his royal robes? He's a target, right? I don't know how certain military etiquettes work. I know some armies in certain wars made it their practice to start with officers and work their way down to send chaos through the units. I don't know what those rules of engagement are now, if that's considered a negative thing or something that's allowed anymore. But basically, he's changing out, doesn't want to be a target. They won't kill me because but deep down inside, Micaiah is in Ahab's head, right? He's got to be. Why does he disguise himself otherwise? And it is so disappointing because Ahab has these little moments everywhere where you think, man, just take a step, half a step this direction, and things will be different for you. But he doesn't. So the king of Syria, verse 31, had commanded 32 captains of his chariots. He says, fight with neither small nor great, but only with the king of Israel. Now this is the man, Ben-Hadad, who had been spared by Ahab, and now he's basically set aside a unit that says, your only job is to kill Ahab. Do not engage in any other part of the battle. You find him and you kill him. And when the captains of the chariot saw Jehoshaphat, they said, it is surely the king of Israel. So they think they found Ahab, and they turned to fight against him, and Jehoshaphat cried out. And when the captains of the chariot saw that it was not the king of Israel, they turned back from pursuing him. 2 Chronicles 18 says that Jehoshaphat cried out to God to save him, and God diverted their attention. And so they leave off fighting him. Verse 34, but a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. Therefore he said to the driver of his chariot, turn around and carry me out of the battle, for I am wounded. And the battle continued that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until at evening he died. So he's hit. So he disguises himself, and there is a certain unit that is sent out by Syria to kill him. That's their only mission, and they can't find him. But there's this random guy with a bow and arrow. And he's not really aiming at anything. And he just lets it fly. Now, where he hits Ahab, I'm not absolutely certain. Okay? When it's talking about the breastplate and the scale, they would have, think of kind of like a Middle Eastern knight, if that makes sense. They would have, you would have the hard armor, but you also have scales of things that ran underneath it. They could stop some things. They were protective in certain ways, but they weren't really the stuff. That's not what you were looking for. You wouldn't want to cover your whole body in it because you wouldn't last long, I'll put it that way. And so whether he hits him, does he let it fly, and does it hit him here in his side where there's an open spot here in his side with the breastplate, or does it hit him in the gut, the lower portion of his gut, where some of the coat of mail is basically, and before the breastplate starts? I don't know, but it's certainly a mortal wound that he puts on him, and it is not an easy shot. I mean, if he had been trying to make the shot, he probably would not have made it, okay? But this is also a way of saying that this is God's directive. God is doing this to Ahab for what he has done in his sins against God. So he propped up his chariot facing the Syrians until at evening he died. And so it seems like he's still commanding the battle. He's just kind of propped up there looking at the battlefield and still kind of directing things until a point in which he dies. And the blood of the wound flowed into the bottom of the chariot, and about sunset a cry went throughout the army, every man to his city and every man to his country. That is, their leader was dead, and now they're all scrambling home, which is what Micaiah said would happen. I'm going to see Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep that have no shepherd. Well, here they are. They're people, and they have no king, and so now they're all just scurrying home. So the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried the king in Samaria, and they washed the chariot by the pool of Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood, and the prostitutes washed themselves in it, according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken. That's chapter 21 and verse 19. You remember after Naboth's vineyard. And so the dogs licked up his blood, and prostitutes washed themselves in it. May have been, these prostitutes mentioned here are temple prostitutes. These are part of worshiping Baal, part of their immorality, their worship, as they called it, which was a very common thing in Old and New Testament times, to treat fornication as if it were an act of worship. And their washing themselves in his blood may be some kind of a pagan ritual of honoring him. But it goes back to show you and remind you of his idolatry. Because here they are, the people that God had forbidden, Deuteronomy 23, 17, and 18, forbidden to ever live amongst the people of Israel. And they're not only living there, but they're honoring this king who has promoted idolatry. It says, so now the rest of the acts of Ahab and all that he did, and the ivory house that he built, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah his son reigned in his place. That is, he accomplished a lot of other things. I mean, when you look at what the Bible says, I mean, we're given from chapter 17 to 22 on Ahab, but that's a relatively short, small amount of information. That's basically the equivalent of summarizing not even a president, because no president rules that long. Basically summarizing a presidency in a paper, one-page, maybe two-page article. And so that's what he's saying. If you want to learn more about Ahab, you can go and you can check the official documents and records, and you can read about some of the stuff, and you will be impressed by what you find, actually. Archaeological discoveries of places that he has built cities, the engineering, the fortification is phenomenal. The artistry is phenomenal. Ivory paneled walls, exotic animals, all these different things. It's phenomenal. And we said when we talked about Ahab at the very beginning when we first met him, secular history remembers Ahab very well and very positively. But God does not. The reason why he gets so much attention in our text is because he was the king that led Israel a step further away from God. Jeroboam was the first one when he introduced the calf worship, and now Ahab is the second one as he takes them into Baal worship. And so that's why he's given some of this attention in this particular context. Okay? All right. Any questions or anything on that? No, he was definitely the, oh yes, he is, there is, let's see, where is this? In the Chronicles, when it talks about their alliance, the language is such that he basically went to Ahab for peace and was kind of the inferior. And so he was one who, he was the weaker of the two, you might put it that way, in more ways than one. Although he was a somewhat godly king. That's what we're going to read about in the next section, hopefully next week, but I think our time is about done, unless anybody has any other questions or things they'd like to say. All right, we'll pick up there and move into 2 Kings, brief statements about Jehoshaphat and Ahaziah.